All right, guys, so we're back with World War II. We're going to finish this up today, kind of looking through the fighting of 1942 to 1945, and then the surrender and meaning of the death of World War II as well. Just so you know, your book doesn't do that great of a job at actually going through the battles that kind of go on from the U.S. entry into the war to its end. There are tons of battles that happen, and some very, very big ones, very interesting battles. But textbooks have moved away from looking at battle history and military history into reasons why things happen. So if you guys want to read any more of that stuff, you can either come and see me, I can direct you in the right area, um, or we can, we'll do a couple of things in class to expand on some other things. But yeah, just not a ton of attention is going to be paid for or towards the actual fighting. We'll go over kind of the general story of how things went. Now, the U.S. is into the war after we left last video lecture, and now there's this decision of what to do, and there's generally some sense of disagreement between the Allies of where they should attack first. Now, the Allies do sign what is known as the Atlantic Charter in 1941, and this simply said that the opponents of the Axis would fight to halt aggression and not gain foreign territory as they entered and engaged in warfare. And on the heels of that, Stalin and Churchill and FDR met in Yalta, which is on the Black Sea, to go over the strategies that are going to be needed to defeat the Axis powers. Here they all are, right? FDR, of course, is in the middle, Churchill to the left, and then Stalin to the right. So they're meeting to try and figure out what to do. And they continue to meet between 1942 and 45 to try and figure out what's going to happen. And what they agree on is to attack Hitler first, and then to fight the war through the unconditional surrender of all Axis powers. So they all agreed that they would not make a separate peace with Hitler until they are defeated completely, or Mussolini for that matter, until they're utterly defeated. And if you remember, Russia kind of broke that pact in World War I by signing the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, and basically it kind of left a one-front war for the United States, Great Britain, and France to fight. But this time we're not going to have a threat of Bolshevik revolution, and so Stalin is able to promise he will fight to the bitter end, and he does. He does exactly that, although there's quite a bit of distrust over the motives of Stalin versus the motives of the rest of the West, which are going to include Churchill and France, and of course America. So anyway, the big disagreement though between the big three right here are where to attack, and Stalin wants to attack on the Western Front. He wants basically Britain and the U.S. to land all their troops on the Western Front to open up a second front, and take some pressure off of this just unrelenting brutal invasion, Operation Barbarossa, that is going on. And so he really wants there to be kind of a detour of German troops away from the Eastern Front to the West. And Churchill and FDR don't necessarily think that this is the best scenario. They appoint Dwight D. Eisenhower as the supreme commander of all Allied forces in the Western Front. And basically FDR and Churchill decide that they are going to attack first through what is known as the soft underbelly of Europe. And this refers to North Africa and Italy, kind of the southern front of Europe. And the idea was to open a third front here to clear the Nazis from the Mediterranean, make sure that trade routes are open, and also to halt Soviet influence in the Balkans. Already you see with this decision that Great Britain doesn't necessarily trust what Stalin is doing. Now basically Churchill and FDR decide to ignore Stalin, and they open this third front first in North Africa through the launching of Operation Torch. And this will be the combined invasion of the north coast of Africa, where German General Erwin Rommel is placed in order to clear the entire Mediterranean Sea and guarantee shipping through the Mediterranean and out through the Suez Canal, we've already mentioned. And once this area is clear, then Allied forces will focus on an attack through Sicily and then up the Italian peninsula to oust Mussolini and basically create a split between Axis powers fighting in the east and then, of course, in the west. So, how is this going to happen? Well, the United States needs to get ready, right? And we have this term known as the Great Arsenal of Democracy, which FDR is going to employ to make sure that the Allies win, okay? Once again, Germans underestimate the incredible ability of the United States to increase their output, and the industrial and agricultural output of the U.S. is staggering. The amount of materials that they are able to produce, it's truly mind-blowing. And if you want to read the stats on page 267, how quickly they are able to churn out materials for war, as well as just basic raw, finished goods for the soldiers and for the populace, it's pretty amazing. And of course, because the men are joining the ranks of soldiers en masse, the work is actually left to women. And this is where we get the idea of Rosie the Riveter. Here we go. And it's kind of a propaganda technique, and with the purpose of showing to women that they are indeed useful and can make a difference not only at home but in the workplace, particularly on the assembly line. So women, basically flock to this call and join the workforce en masse. And they really are the backbone of industrial output as we move through the war years. What we get out of this situation is another episode of total war in the U.S. And what I would say is actually it's total war on steroids. And so the U.S. is going to regulate the process of raw materials, how they're processed into finished goods, what will be produced when and how much. There'll be new industries that'll spring up with full government oversight, and the government will regulate prices. There's very important usage of propaganda through radios and motion pictures, etc. Some of the film reels I've showed you in class will be part of that oversight from the federal government. And overall in this war, just like in World War I, but to an even greater extent, the national government is involved in shaping the path and the daily lives of almost every one of its citizens. It's incredible how much the government actually has a say in what can and cannot be produced, or even where people are going to work. Now, back to the fighting. What's happening? Well, the way that your textbook divides the fighting up is by sea and by air. And this is truly not new in many ways. The way that war will be waged on the seas is through aircraft carrier, and we call that carrier warfare. New naval vessels are kind of arranged around an aircraft carrier, and this is especially true in the Pacific. Aircraft carriers would be supported by other ships, ranging from destroyers to cruisers to whatever. And those are basically the extent at which naval vessels progressed during World War I. If you remember the famous Dreadnought, that would be more or less the equivalent of a battleship today. Aircraft carriers are going to dwarf it in terms of size and ability to shape warfare, like I said, specifically in the Pacific. And if one of these aircraft carriers was destroyed, then it would be considered as a major victory for the opposite side. And so therefore, strategic bombardment, or the specific bombing of enemies' economic and military facilities, not only on the mainland, but also of strategic bombing of their aircraft carriers, is going to be very, very important. Now, what happens is the Allies will actually pursue a policy known as terror bombing. Don't think that the Nazis were the only people who did this. The Allies are involved in terror bombing quite a bit. And this is actually a picture here on the screen of the effects of incendiary bombs in Tokyo, right? These are bombs that are meant to start fires. And in Tokyo and Dresden, they're employed later in the war to absolutely horrific effect. In Dresden, for instance, about 100,000 civilians end up dying from these incendiary bombs, and it really does catch the whole city on fire. And that's on purpose. The purpose is to destroy the morale of the people living in those cities, to destroy the citizens. So don't think the U.S. has some sort of, moral high ground in this sort of area. We definitely did our fair share of terror bombing civilians. And in fact, one of the main arguments for dropping the atomic bombs is that the amount of death to civilians as a result of atomic bombs would actually be less than continued firebombing and terror bombing of Tokyo and the other surrounding cities. So it was actually seen as I guess, a kind of exercise in humanity to only kill a couple 100,000 versus maybe upwards of 1 million Japanese. Of course, U-boats are employed in World War II as well as in World War I. U-boats, though, aren't going to be as important in making sure that the British stop their blockade. The British blockade is not, anywhere nearly as effective in World War II as it was in World War I, mostly because the Germans have such an enormous landmass. They can pull supplies from, anywhere, basically, that they control, which is most of Europe. Also, they actually keep a shipping lane in Norwegian waters open. The U.S., right after naval battles, they keep their carriers afloat. Even the aircraft carriers at Pearl Harbor are off in the ocean. They're away. They're not in Pearl Harbor, and they are able to protect those very well as they engage in battle with the Japanese, specifically at the Battle of Midway. The United States cracks the Japanese naval code, so we kind of know what their plans are before they're actually implemented. And the Japanese, this truly crushes them really from the get-go because they're so reliant on shipping. They have to make sure they get food and raw materials to supply their armies on the Asian mainland and their garrison in the Western Pacific. And they also need to make sure that their people, their citizens at home, are fed. So as soon as the United States starts interrupting their shipping lanes, and that's not just their military shipping, but also their merchant shipping, this kind of spells the end of support for this enormous empire that Japan has started to form. Now the Allies start winning the air battles after 1942. Remember, the Japanese have an enormously effective first 5 months of the war between 1941 and 1942, but that tide turns, like I mentioned, at the Battle of Midway, and the Allies are able to sink Japan's merchant ships and cut off Japan from Asia and other Pacific islands. So overall, between naval warfare and aerial bombardment, these are all new forces that unleash an absolutely horrific casualty rate. Not to mention there are a bunch of new technological innovations that aren't necessarily even implemented full scale. For instance, jet planes are new, and Germans are the ones that develop those, but they aren't really implemented to a large effect. We've already mentioned incendiary bombs, but also cruise missiles and ballistic missiles will also be new. Now, let's go through the actual run-up of fighting. Okay, the Battle of Stalingrad. This is the major turning point on the Eastern Front, or on the European theater. Remember that Hitler had sent an enormous force, the largest land invasion ever, to conquer the Soviet Union, and he turns to Stalingrad in the south to take the city, and he actually is able to take it fairly well. It's a massive industrial city here, but by the winter of 1942 and 43, the Soviets have a fantastic counterattack, are able to encircle the Nazi positions and actually capture 95,000 German troops that are all kind of out with the 6th Army. And in your textbook is actually an incredible statistic that of the 350,000 men who fought in the 6th Army during World War II, only 5,000 would ever return. Absolutely staggering casualty rate. Another major battle that saw the Germans get pushed back is the Battle of Kursk. This was probably the greatest tank battle in history. This is also in 1943. There's great videos on this stuff. You guys should look it up. And this led to, once again, a pushback of the Nazis by the Soviets. Surprisingly, the Soviet military machine is able to really outstrip the production rates of the Germans. And this is kind of startling because we associate German industrial might with really the reason why the war started at all. But the Soviets are able to outpaced that production in a very short amount of time. The Soviets have 6 million men, which is double than that of Germany, and also have 3 times as many artillery, tanks, and airplanes. So this meant that even though, more of the percentage of the German populace is in the army, the Soviets could attack on several different fronts at the same time. And like in World War One, the Germans just run out of people. They just run out of people. They can't keep up with the production of what the Soviets are doing. And so this was truly the end of the Nazi march. And really it begs the question, what would have happened if Hitler had never invaded Russia to begin with? If they had kept their 10-year non-aggression pact and kind of sat where they were with their spheres of influence. It's really interesting and really a massive military blunder by Hitler. Just didn't work. Overall, 1.1 million Soviet casualties will die in the invasion of the Soviet Union. Close to 500,000 dead. So, I don't know, I think I just said that 1.1 million Soviet death casualties. That's just casualties in general. German slash Axis losses were in the hundreds of thousands, if not close to a million. And overall, the German invasion will take the lives of 27 million in the USSR in general over all the years. And this includes civilians. So it's pretty insane the amount of losses that the Soviet Union is able to sustain and yet keep throwing men over and over and over at the Allies. Eventually, the Allies, after winning successful campaigns in North Africa and then in Italy, will launch what is known as D-Day, the invasion of Normandy and the invasion of France, Nazi-occupied France on June 6, 1944. And as they continue to march across the French countryside, they basically, between the Allies in the West and the Soviets in the East, put Nazi Germany in a vice as they kind of press inwards. And eventually what happens is Hitler will commit suicide and they will surrender in May 1945, and the war will be over in Europe. It is known as VE Day. And even though the war in Europe is over, the war in Asia is not. And the idea was that the Soviet Union would actually come to the aid of the United States and declare war on Japan as soon as war activities were wrapped up in Europe. Anyway, let's trace the events that are going on in Asia, though. So in mid-1942, this is the Battle of Midway. This is where a massive Japanese aircraft carrier is smashed, and it kind of turns the tide of the Japanese expansion in Asia. Another Allied victory in Guadalcanal in early 1943 off the coast of Australia will begin what is known as a campaign known as the Island Hopping Campaign, where the United States is able to hop from one island to the other to get closer and closer and closer to the Japanese mainland. And here we go. So there's a map. Battle of Midway is right up here. All right. And they push actually southeast. They don't go straight to Asia. They push southeast, kind of outflank the Japanese, win in Guadalcanal, Coral Sea, and keep their march through Saipan, Guam, through Iwo Jima, Okinawa, and they're able, from the Mariana Islands, actually to bomb Tokyo and the rest of Japanese mainland. They couldn't do that from Hawaii. The man in charge of leading this invasion is General Douglas MacArthur. He was the one that was forced to flee the Philippines in early 1942, and sure enough, true to his word, he is back. All right. He is intent on seizing the Philippines and Taiwan, and he does both of those things in late 1944. Another American commander, Admiral Chester Nimitz, is able to capture Saipan and Tinian in the Marianas, and he is the one that sets up the basis from which the Americans are able to bomb Japanese cities with these flying fortresses, the B-29s. Iwo Jima in Okinawa. Iwo Jima, by the way, that famous sculpture of American troops raising the flag, that's from Iwo Jima. These two battles in the early 1945 show just how difficult a land invasion of Japan is going to be. And as large in large measure, because of the results of these two battles, we sense that the Japanese will fight to the bitter end. And so, you know, foreign policy, military policy, and dealing with the Japanese is going to get closer and closer to dropping atomic bombs. Also, the Japanese implement kamikaze attacks very effectively during these last few months of battle. Kamikaze techniques weren't really used that much early on. There was no reason to do that. The Japanese were gaining at an absolutely extraordinary rate. They didn't need to have suicide air attacks. But they really start to implement these to do a devastating effect as the mindset for the Japanese soldiers, becomes, like I said, to fight to the bitter end. Harry Truman, sensing the fact that this is going to be a very, very difficult end to the war, he doesn't want to risk a full-scale invasion that may lead to a million U.S. casualties, decides after FDR dies to drop the two atomic bombs. Hiroshima and Nagasaki are the two areas that are bombed on August 6th and August 9th, and kills a total of 200,000. And these two targets are not solely military targets. It was certainly meant to target civilian areas as well. And so when we see the actual devastation, I'll pull a picture up here of these cities. There we go. That would be, I forget, that's Hiroshima. It's wherever the dome is. It's amazing this dome stood, even though everything else is rubble around it. Even though there are, I guess, strategic industrial facilities here, it really was a civilian target to draw the attention of the Japanese emperor and the other military leaders, and it's effective. By September 2nd, 1945. Japan will surrender. That is known as VJ Day. Roosevelt, of course, never lived to see the end of it. He dies before he is ever able to see the full conclusion of World War II. There's Harry Truman, by the way. Now, historians have been debating, really ever since, over whether this was an appropriate course of action for Truman to take. And the big debate is over whether Japan would have surrendered on their own, even with a blockade and air bombing. Maybe a full-scale invasion wasn't necessary at all. By this point, Japan does not have enough raw materials and foodstuffs to support itself. So, not only cannot wage war, but the idea of continuing to have an antagonistic enemy that is basically knocking on its door, bombing the crap out of it, and not allowing any resources to come in, that seems as nonsensical. So the I guess more conservative line of thought would be, if we held out long enough and kept bombing, eventually the Japanese would have broken. And they actually blamed Truman as being too hasty in ending the war. Maybe it ended it a month or two early, but he unleashed the incredible death, the visual of death that atomic weapons created, and by doing so, shaped post-war weapons policy and military engagements in a way that basically puts the United States at the top of the totem pole, so to speak. So we don't really know if this was the only course of action that we had. It certainly seems like it was a little rash. And Truman was that kind of president. He kind of just did things, and he was very antagonistic. He was a little firebrand, and so we continue to debate over whether this was a good decision or not. And of course, there's many different counter arguments and arguments pro and con. Anyway, the meaning of the war is the last thing we're doing today. Why so many civilians die? Okay, well, more lethal technology, of course, genocidal practices. That leads to quite a bit of deaths. Civilian deaths will exceed military deaths, right, due to starvation, disease, labor camps, and deportations. The Soviet Union, of course, experiences the most death with 27 million, like we already mentioned, and China will be second with 10 million, mostly because they get an extra 2 years of fighting and 4 more years of fighting compared to the United States. These numbers, right, 37 million people, absolutely eclipsed the numbers of U.S. and British deaths, which only amount to 700,000. So 37 million to 370,000. So, in terms of death toll, the British and the Americans don't necessarily suffer anywhere near as much as these two areas. And in large part, it's going to shape in China how communism will ascend, but also in the Soviet Union, it's going to help create a sense that the Soviet Union deserves to kind of be on the stage of world dominance after they have lost so much after the war. 30 million Europeans are forced to move during World War II. There is a new term known as disabled person, or DP, and 30 million of those people will be wandering around in Europe. 17 million Germans will be driven out of Eastern Europe, and 1 million Jews will go to Palestine. So massive, massive movement of peoples, and actually the Germans lose the most. They are the ones that are actually moved out of their traditional areas of settlement that have been dating back, for literally eons. For instance, Prussia will disappear completely off the map and will be sucked up into Poland. So overall, Europe and Asia crushed from this. Cities in Central and Eastern Europe are absolutely shelled into oblivion. Railroads, canals, roads are all rubble, right? Millions of acres of farmland is damaged. And the total amount of damages would be $1.5 trillion in 1945, or $20.5 trillion today, which is about $60,000 per person in today's money. So, when we talked about buying families' houses with the money spent in the war, this is the actual cost, right? So a very similar figure to today. If you have a family of 4, that's a $240,000 house, right? For every person in America. $60,000 was every person in America. So anyway, that's it for World War II. Enjoy the questions. Feel free to go down the rabbit hole. Like I said, it's tough to do all of this justice. I wish we could just have a course in the world wars. Could kind of be a lot slower than Operation Torch and all that sort of stuff. But if this interests you, then go and dig. And there's all sorts of amazing stories of soldiers fighting, not just on the American side, but certainly on the French, British, and Soviet sides as well.